This shocking story begins by showing a couple named Mark and Elizabeth, who lived with their only son Jacob. However, Mark and Elizabeth were not married yet. They had moved away from their parents and started living together. After some time, Mark and Elizabeth reached a point where they decided to get married. They held a grand wedding, following all the rituals, and moved forward in their life. Mark and Elizabeth were very happy, and they were heading towards their honeymoon. But as soon as their car entered a tunnel, everything went blank. What terrifying event occurred inside will be revealed later. 6 years had passed since then, and now we see Mark, who worked at a prestigious law firm and earned a good salary. But now, we find out that Mark and Elizabeth are no longer together. After finishing work, Mark returned home, where his father was present. Mark's father had developed memory loss due to old age, and while watching TV, he saw Elizabeth giving an interview at a news reporting company. Mark's father then asked him where his wife, Elizabeth, was. Mark, deeply saddened, told him that it had been 6 years, and she no longer lived with them. The truth was that 6 years ago, when Mark and Elizabeth were on their honeymoon, their car met with an accident while passing through a large tunnel. Due to a mistake, their car crashed, and their son Jacob died in the accident. Mark and Elizabeth blamed each other for the tragedy, as they had argued during the trip, which became the reason they couldn't forgive each other and eventually separated. In fact, they were even planning to get a divorce. However, Mark's father had memory loss, which is why he repeatedly asked about these things. It seemed that Mark and Elizabeth had both moved on in their lives. Their only son, who was now no longer alive, had been their world. At this point, Mark receives a call, where the person informs him that the tenants of his old house have moved out, meaning the house is now vacant. Mark tells the caller that he doesn't care about the old house and asks him to sell it at a good price. However, before that, he mentions wanting to collect some documents and things from the house. So, after finishing work, he drives to the old house. This was the same place where he had lived with his wife and son Jacob, and many memories had been made here. As Mark was about to enter the house, a girl named Dash suddenly attacked him. Mark, thinking it was just a prank, forgives her and enters the house. A little while later, Dash apologizes through a message written on a piece of paper. While Mark was inside the house, looking around, memories of his son Jacob started flooding back. He had spent so much time here with his wife and son, and everything around him reminded him of how much he loved his son. He became so emotional that he started crying, wishing his son was still here to enjoy these moments with him. As Mark was lost in his thoughts, he suddenly heard the sound of someone running upstairs. When he went to check, he saw a woman named Janice, who had come to meet the old tenants of the house. When she asked Mark, he simply told her that the tenants had moved out, and now Janice was also about to leave. However, Janice then tells Mark that she is a spiritual leader and offers her help, telling him to contact her if he ever needs anything. Mark, however, didn't believe in such things and asked Janice to leave. Just as Mark was about to message Elizabeth, the doors of the house suddenly began closing on their own. Mark got a little scared, wondering what was going on since he was the only one in the house. Soon, strange noises started echoing in his ears, disturbing him. As he moved forward, a small child appeared in front of him. After experiencing something unsettling, Mark was suddenly hit on the head and fell unconscious. When the child was shown, it became clear that the child was none other than Mark himself. And Jacob, Elizabeth's son, was the one whose spirit had returned for some reason, seeking revenge from his parents. What dark secret was behind this? To find out, we will have to look ahead. The next day, Mark wakes up and checks the time on his phone, realizing he's late for his meeting. His phone is also having trouble making calls. Ignoring everything else, Mark quickly heads to his meeting. At the company, he hands his mobile to an employee for repairs and to extract some important information. Meanwhile, he goes into an important meeting that had been waiting for him, even though he wasn't interested in it at all. However, he had to conduct the meeting, no matter what. After finishing the meeting, when he checks his phone, he discovers some video footage in the mobile, footage that wasn't from anyone else, but from himself, when he had been unconscious at home. Mark was confused, wondering who took those photos of him while he was unconscious. He thought it might have been the girl, Dash, playing a prank. After finishing work, Mark heads back to his old house, where the incident happened the previous night. But when he arrives, he is shocked to find his son Jacob standing there in front of him. Mark couldn't understand what was happening. His son had died, so how could he be alive and standing there in front of him, looking perfectly fine? As Mark moves to touch his son Jacob, he is shocked by a strong jolt. Mark is hurt and falls to the ground. At that moment, it hits him, the reality of it all. His son, Jacob, had returned from the dead. Mark rushes to tell his wife, Elizabeth, about this. He insists that their son Jacob has come back and they need to see him. However, Elizabeth doesn't believe him. She thinks Mark might be playing some trick to get them back together. Despite Mark repeatedly asking her to come and see, Elizabeth refuses. But deep down, Elizabeth also loved her son Jacob dearly. When Jacob's name came up, Elizabeth decided to visit the old house just to see for herself. There, she found Jacob's spirit, who was physically present but playing while wearing a mask. Looking at his body language and movements, Elizabeth began to believe that this was indeed her son. Both of them were shocked, but then Elizabeth realized that this must be some kind of trick by Mark. The child had a mask on, and it was possible that Mark had hired another child to pretend to be Jacob and introduce him to her. Elizabeth, in disbelief, slapped Mark and left the house. Mark, now confused about what to do, recalled a woman named Janice, a paranormal expert. He quickly found her contact information and went to her for help, explaining everything that had happened to him. Janice didn't hesitate and immediately believed him. Mark was surprised, as she was the first person who trusted him. Janice then explained that the first thing Mark needed to do was ask his son's spirit what its purpose was for returning to the world. There had to be a reason behind it, and once that reason was fulfilled, Jacob's spirit would leave. Janice advised Mark to ask his son's spirit about his wishes. Mark, with this new information, rushed home and began asking his son's spirit what he wanted. Jacob's spirit told him that he wanted an automatic train, which Mark had promised to get him for his next birthday. Along with that, Jacob's spirit also expressed that he wanted to see his mother. While Mark could easily fulfill the promise of the train, convincing Elizabeth to return was going to be much harder. Still, Mark went to his ex-wife Elizabeth and explained everything, convincing her to trust him one last time. Eventually, they both returned to the old house. There, Mark quietly showed Elizabeth the spirit of their son, Jacob. Elizabeth couldn't believe her eyes. She rushed towards him, but as soon as she reached out to touch him, Mark stopped her. It was obvious that Elizabeth couldn't stay away from her son for long. As soon as she touched Jacob, she was shocked, just like Mark had been. They both realized that they couldn't touch Jacob's spirit in that way, but they were happy to be able to spend time with him. They decided that they would take turns spending time with Jacob, Elizabeth during the day and Mark at night. Both of them felt like they were living their dream, but at the same time, they were aware that Jacob's spirit couldn't stay with them forever. Mark began applying everything Janice had taught him to find out the exact reason behind Jacob's return. He became determined to learn why Jacob's spirit had come back and what the reason was for his return. The next day, it was shown that Mark had quit his job to spend more time with his son Jacob. When Elizabeth found out, she misunderstood his decision and began yelling at Mark. She thought that Mark was trying to separate her from Jacob on purpose. An argument broke out between them, just like before, and they began fighting. Suddenly, the windows in the house began to break, and both Mark and Elizabeth were frightened. Jacob's spirit appeared, as it was clear that he was the one causing the disturbances. Jacob didn't want Mark and Elizabeth to fight again. He urged them to stay calm and reconcile, asking them to shake hands and make peace. As the mirrors shattered, one of the shards cut Elizabeth's neck, causing her to bleed. Mark immediately took care of her, giving her first aid. For a moment, they forgot all their past grievances and decided to enjoy their time together with their son Jacob. However, Elizabeth began to feel as if someone else was in the house with them, although in reality, no one else was there. Another truth emerged. After Elizabeth had separated from Mark, she had remarried a wealthy man. He had several stepdaughters who were living a privileged life. Mark eventually learns about Elizabeth's remarriage and her life with her stepdaughters, but by this point, he is no longer concerned with her past. He is only focused on being with his son, Jacob. Elizabeth, too, finds herself drawn to Jacob and wants to spend time with him. One day, Jacob, while sleeping with his father Mark, tells him about his mother's other daughters, but Mark reassures him that his mother loves him the most. Jacob's spirit responds, acknowledging that Elizabeth loves him dearly, but the ongoing conflict between Mark and her is causing tension. One day, Mark is playing with Dash, the young girl, and Jacob's spirit is saddened as he wishes he could play with his father too, but as a spirit, he can't physically interact with him. Elizabeth suddenly starts yelling, claiming she saw someone coming toward her in the corner, looking like they were about to attack her. However, after investigation, nothing is found. Later, Janice, the paranormal expert, visits Mark's home. After hearing about Jacob's spirit, Janice warns Mark that the situation could become dangerous if they don't help Jacob move on. She advises him to remove Jacob's spirit from their home. When Elizabeth overhears this, she becomes upset and insists that Janice leave. She doesn't want anyone taking her son away from her, even if he is just a spirit. Elizabeth wants to cherish the remaining time with Jacob. Despite this, Mark and Elizabeth start to enjoy their time with Jacob. Elizabeth dreams of taking her son to the beach and enjoying nature together, even though Jacob's spirit cannot physically interact with the world. For her, the connection with Jacob's spirit is still deeply meaningful. The family, even with the supernatural presence, starts to feel more like a whole family again. Elizabeth and Mark, who had been separated for so long, begin to reconnect, and they find joy in these moments together. As Mark and Elizabeth grow closer, reconnecting emotionally and physically, they seem to be rekindling their old bond. It feels as though nothing ever happened between them, and they cherish the moments together. However, the next day, Elizabeth's current husband arrives and sees her with Mark. He confronts her, saying that he no longer needs her and that their relationship is over. Elizabeth is devastated by this and falls into deep depression, crying over the situation. Meanwhile, Mark continues to have conversations with Jacob's spirit. Jacob reveals something shocking to him, that it was he, Jacob, who had unbuckled his seatbelt during the car accident, leading to his own death. Mark had always blamed Elizabeth for their son's death, but now he learns the truth. This revelation brings a wave of shock and guilt for Mark, as he had been blaming his ex-wife for something that was not her fault. Now, Elizabeth, having left her husband, decides to live with Mark again. She begins to spend more time with Jacob's spirit and feels a deep sense of connection to him. One day, while spending time with her son, Jacob's spirit opens the door, and Elizabeth follows him inside. Suddenly, a brilliant light appears, and in that light, Elizabeth sees her deceased mother. Her mother speaks to her, telling her how happy she is in heaven and invites Elizabeth to join her there. Elizabeth, not fully understanding what is happening, becomes disoriented and starts to lose consciousness. As she collapses, Mark rushes to her side. Her nose starts to bleed, and Mark, in a panic, takes her to the hospital to make sure she gets the medical attention she needs. Elizabeth was treated as quickly as possible. Mark asked his wife what had happened that made her unconscious. Elizabeth simply said that she had stopped taking her antidepressant pills, and that might be the reason for the bleeding. They quickly got the necessary medicines and returned home. When Mark went to his son Jacob's spirit, he saw that Jacob was assembling and playing with his automatic train, which was one of his wishes that he had asked Mark for. But suddenly, Jacob's spirit told his father Mark that he would be traveling on the train in the future, and his mother Elizabeth would also be with him. Mark found this very strange, so he immediately ran to his wife Elizabeth. Elizabeth was deeply depressed and was crying a lot. Mark immediately asked her the truth because bleeding from the nose couldn't be related to depression. Then Elizabeth revealed a truth: she had terminal cancer, and it was now in its final stage. That meant Elizabeth didn't have much time left. Mark, upon hearing this, asked her why she hadn't told him before. He started crying a lot and confessed to his wife that when their son had the accident, it wasn't her fault. It was actually their son who had opened his seat belt, which caused his death. When Elizabeth heard this, a huge burden was lifted from her heart because she had always blamed herself for her son's death. Unfortunately, despite all of this, Elizabeth didn't have much time left. Mark held Elizabeth and cried, realizing that there was nothing they could do now. Whatever time Elizabeth had left, Mark made sure to enjoy every moment with her. They both sat together by the beach and watched Jacob's spirit, enjoying the time they had left. Mark and Elizabeth would never forget these moments in their lives. Now, we see Elizabeth in the hospital, taking her last breaths. Then, there is a scene showing a train, through which Jacob's spirit and Elizabeth are traveling. They were both very happy together. Then we find out that Elizabeth had passed away in the hospital, meaning her soul and Jacob's soul were together, enjoying the afterlife with each other. Now we see Mark, who after the death of his wife, was completely alone. Mark came to his wife's grave every day to remember her, paying his respects and thinking about her. Jacob and Elizabeth's spirits had returned to clear all the misunderstandings between the father and mother and reunite them one last time. Spirits of the deceased only return when there is an unfulfilled wish, and that was the reason Jacob's spirit came back. He also clarified the truth that the accident happened because of his own mistake. If he hadn't returned, Elizabeth would never have been able to lift the burden of guilt from herself. Mark was a bit happy because, at least, he got to spend some time with his wife before she passed. But he would never be able to forget his wife, Elizabeth. And with all of this, our adventurous story comes to an end.